What you're about to hear is the true story of two young British men who vanished without a trace in the remote wilderness of South Africa. The only clue to their fate? A damaged video camera containing footage that would chill investigators to the bone. This is the story of Reece Williams and Bradley Cawthorn, and the mystery that continues to haunt the abandoned grounds of Rorkes Drift. But before we dive into what happened to them, we need to understand the dark history of the place they chose to visit, and the string of unexplained deaths that occurred there long before these two tourists ever set foot on South African soil. The year was 1879. The British Empire, at the height of its power, had sent thousands of troops into southern Africa as part of the Anglo-Zulu War. What they didn't expect was the fierce resistance they would face from one of the most formidable warrior societies the world had ever known. On January 22nd of that year, at a small mission, a station known as Rorkes Drift, approximately 150 British and colonial soldiers found themselves facing an army of 3,000 to 4,000 Zulu warriors. What followed was one of the most famous last stands in military history. For 12 brutal hours, the defenders held their position against wave after wave of attacks. The ground ran red with blood. Bodies piled up on both sides. When the battle finally ended, over 350 Zulu warriors lay dead, along with 17 British soldiers. The Battle of Rorkes Drift became legend. It was immortalized in the 1964 film Zulu, starring Michael Caine. For the British, it represented courage and determination against impossible odds. But for the Zulu people, it represented something else entirely. A sacred ground soaked in the blood of their ancestors, a place where hundreds of warriors gave their lives defending their homeland. For over a century, the site remained largely untouched. Local Zulu communities regarded it with a mixture of respect and unease. There were stories, passed down through generations, of strange occurrences at Rorkes Drift. Travelers reported hearing battle cries echoing across the plains at night. Farmers claimed to see ghostly figures moving through the grass. Some said the spirits of the fallen warriors still patrolled the area, forever guarding their land against invaders. In 1996, with South Africa emerging from the apartheid era and looking to boost tourism, a group of international investors saw an opportunity. They would transform Rorkes Drift into a world-class tourist destination. The plans were ambitious: a state-of-the-art museum that would tell the story of the famous battle, complete with authentic artifacts, interactive displays, and historical reenactments. 4 kilometers away, they would build a luxury hotel lodge, where tourists could stay while visiting the site. The hotel was to be spectacular: 3 large circular buildings with traditional thatched roofs designed to blend African architectural heritage with modern luxury. Each building would house multiple suites with views of Sinquindi Mountain. There would be a restaurant serving both local and international cuisine, a bar, a swimming pool, and guided tours to the battle site. Construction began in early 1997. The first few weeks proceeded without incident. Workers, mostly local men from surrounding communities, reported to the site each morning and worked until sunset. But then, strange things began to happen. Tools would go missing overnight, only to be found the next morning arranged in odd patterns. Equipment would malfunction for no apparent reason. Some workers reported feeling watched while laboring on the site, as if unseen eyes were following their every move. A few claimed to hear whispers in languages they couldn't understand carried on the wind. The site foreman, a practical man named Jan van der Merwe, dismissed these concerns as superstition. He pushed the workers to maintain the schedule, insisting they were falling behind. The investors were getting impatient. Money was being spent. Results were expected. Then, in June of 1997, 3 months after construction began, the first worker disappeared. His name was Thabo Mthembu, a 4-year-old father of 3 from a nearby village. On June 12th, Thabo arrived at the construction site as usual. Several co-workers saw him that morning. He was working on the foundation of the main building, mixing concrete. Around midday, he told another worker he needed to relieve himself and walked toward a portable toilet at the edge of the site. He never came back. Initially, his co-workers assumed he'd gone home sick without telling anyone. But when Thabo didn't return the next day, and the day after that, his family reported him missing. Police conducted a search of the area but found nothing. It was as if Thabo had simply vanished into thin air. 2 weeks later, another worker disappeared. Then another. By September, 5 men had gone missing from the construction site. The local community was terrified. Families begged their husbands, fathers, and sons to quit their jobs. Some workers did leave, but others couldn't afford to. They needed the money. The police launched a full-scale investigation. Dozens of officers combed the area around the construction site and the old battleground. For days, they found nothing. Then, one afternoon, a search dog led its handler to a gully about a kilometer from the hotel site. What they found there would haunt the investigators for years to come. The remains were scattered across a wide area, picked clean by scavengers. Forensic examination confirmed they belonged to 2 of the missing workers. The bones showed signs of trauma consistent with animal predation. Tooth marks covered the larger bones. The victims appeared to have been attacked and consumed by wild animals. 3 days later, another set of remains was discovered less than a kilometer away. in similar condition. Again, the evidence pointed to animal attack. But what kind of animal? And why were these attacks happening with such frequency in an area where no large predator populations were known to exist? Despite the grim discoveries, the construction company decided to continue the project. The investors had already poured millions into the development. They couldn't walk away now. Extra security was hired. Workers were told to stay in groups and never wander off alone. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. Then 2 more workers vanished on the same night. This time, the disappearances broke the project. Workers refused to return to the site. The families of the missing men organized protests. Local tribal elders held meetings, declaring that the construction had angered ancestral spirits. Some claimed the development was disturbing sacred ground, that the blood spilled during the battle had cursed the land, making it hostile to any outsiders who tried to exploit it for profit. Within weeks, the investors pulled out. Construction equipment was abandoned in place. The partially built hotel structures were left to decay under the African sun. The museum, nearly complete but never opened, was locked up and forgotten. Plans for Rorke's Drift as a tourist destination were permanently shelved. And there the site remained, slowly being reclaimed by nature, a monument to a cursed project that should never have been started. 12 years after the construction stopped, 2 young British men decided to visit Rorke's Drift, completely unaware of its dark recent history. Reece Williams was 25 years old, a history enthusiast from Cardiff, Wales. He had grown up hearing family stories about his 4 times great-grandfather, Private John Williams, who had fought at the Battle of Rorke's Drift and survived. The battle had earned John Williams the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. For Reece, visiting the site where his ancestor had fought was a lifelong dream, a way to connect with his family history and honor the man who had shown such courage under fire. Bradley Cawthorn, 27, was Reece's best friend since secondary school. Where Reece was thoughtful and interested in history, Bradley was more impulsive and adventurous. He was getting married in 3 months to his longtime girlfriend, Emma, and this trip to South Africa was meant to be one last adventure before settling down into married life. Bradley wasn't particularly interested in military history, but he was a huge rugby fan, and when Reece suggested they combine a visit to Rorke's Drift with watching the British and Irish Lions tour South Africa, Bradley couldn't resist. The Lions tour was a massive sporting event, held only once every 4 years, where the best rugby players from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland joined forces to play against Southern Hemisphere teams. In 2009, they were facing the Springboks, the South African national team and reigning world champions. For rugby fans like Bradley and Reece, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. The 2 friends had arrived in South Africa a week earlier, staying in Durban, a coastal city in the KwaZulu-Natal province. They'd been to 2 matches already, soaking up the atmosphere, enjoying the local culture, and making friends with rugby fans from around the world. But Reece had another goal for the trip. He wanted to visit Rorke's Drift before the final match, to pay his respects at the memorial where his great-grandfather's name was inscribed. Bradley had been reluctant at first. Rorke's Drift was 260 kilometers inland from Durban, a 4-hour drive through increasingly remote countryside. But Reece had been insistent. This might be his only chance to visit. Eventually, Bradley agreed. They would make it a day-trip drive out in the morning, spend a few hours at the site, and be back in Durban by evening. On the morning of June 17, 2009, the 2 friends rented a white Jeep and set off from their hotel. It was a beautiful winter morning in South Africa. The sky was clear and blue, the temperature cool but pleasant. They had a GPS device, a map, and Bradley's video camera, which he'd been using to document their entire trip. The drive started on modern highways but gradually transitioned to narrower roads as they moved inland. The landscape changed from urban sprawl to rolling hills covered in grassland. They passed through small towns, each one seeming more remote than the last. Eventually, they turned onto a dirt road that cut through vast open plains. The scenery was hauntingly beautiful, but also profoundly isolated. Tall grass stretched to the horizon, broken only by scattered acacia trees and distant hills. They passed a few traditional homesteads, small clusters of round, thatched roof huts, but saw almost no people. Occasionally, they'd spot cattle grazing in the distance, but the land seemed eerily empty. As they drove deeper into this remote landscape, neither Reece nor Bradley could have known they were heading toward an appointment with a mystery that would never be solved. After nearly 4 hours of driving, bouncing along increasingly rough dirt roads, Reece and Bradley finally spotted their destination. A small sign, faded and barely readable, pointed toward a dirt driveway leading off the main trail. They turned and followed it for about half a kilometer until they reached a clearing at the base of a large hill. There it was, the abandoned Rorke's Drift Tourist Center and Museum. Bradley was filming as they approached, and his voice, captured on the camera's audio, expressed immediate disappointment. "That's it in there?" he said. "God, this place really is a shithole. There's barely anything here." Reece's response was patient, as if he'd expected his friend's reaction. "Well, they never finished building this place, that's what makes it abandoned. The museum building sat at the place's base of the hill, its white paint peeling and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The roof, once red, had rusted to a dark brown. Wooden pillars that supported the porch roof were gray and splintered. Weeds grew thick around the foundation. Windows were dark and empty. The whole place had an air of desolation about it, as if it had been forgotten by the world. They parked the Jeep near the entrance and grabbed their gear, the video camera, a flashlight, a backpack with water and snacks, and the wreath of red poppies that Reece had brought to leave at the memorial. As they walked toward the building, their footsteps crunched on the gravel path, the only sound in the profound silence of the place. But as they stepped onto the porch, something caught Bradley's attention that stopped him in his tracks. "Reece?" Bradley's voice had changed. The casual tone was gone, replaced by something more uncertain. "What the hell are those?" "What the hell is what?" Reece replied still, walking forward. "Those," Bradley said, pointing. On either side of the main entrance door, mounted to the walls, were 5 wooden masks. Each mask was carved to depict an animal face, not domestic animals, but predatory ones. The craftsmanship was crude but effective. The masks had pointed ears, elongated snouts, and bared teeth carved into the wood. The eyes were empty holes that seemed to stare at whoever approached. At first glance, as Reece would later say on camera, they assumed the masks must have been part of the original museum, display some kind of cultural exhibit about traditional African art or tribal customs. But as Reece examined them more closely, something didn't seem right. "I doubt it. Hyenas' ears are round, not pointy," Reece said, studying one of the masks. "A wolf, then?" Bradley suggested. "Wolves in Africa, Brad? Really?" Reece responded with a hint of sarcasm. But as Reece looked more carefully at the wood, he noticed something that made him uneasy. The masks weren't old. Despite the crude carving style, the wood looked relatively fresh. Certainly nothing like the decades-old artifacts that would have been part of a 1,992 museum display. These masks, Reece realized, had been placed here recently, perhaps within the last few months, maybe even weeks. The question was, who had put them there, and why? For a moment, both friends stood on the porch, staring at the masks. There was something unsettling about them, something that went beyond their crude appearance. They seemed less like art and more like warnings, or markers. But they'd come all this way. They weren't going to turn back now. Reece approached the main entrance door and tried the handle. It was locked, which wasn't surprising given that the place had been abandoned for over a decade. The door was solid wood, weathered, but still sturdy. "Ah, that's a shame," Reece said, his disappointment evident. "I was hoping it wasn't locked." "That's all right," Bradley replied. And then, before Reece could react, Bradley handed him the video camera and approached the door himself. "Brad, what are you?" Reece started to say, but Bradley had already taken a step back and launched a kick at the door near the handle. The first kick bounced off, so did the second. But on the third attempt, there was a crack of splitting wood, and on the fourth kick, the door swung inward with a crash. "What have you just done, Brad?" Reece's voice was a mixture of shock and anger. Bradley turned to him with a sheepish grin. "Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't you want to go inside?" Reece stood there for a moment, clearly torn between his desire to explore and his shock at Bradley's casual vandalism. "Can't believe you've just done that, Brad," Bradley shrugged. "Yeah, well, I'm getting married soon. I'm stressed." It was a ridiculous excuse, and both of them knew it. But what was done was done. The door hung open, revealing darkness beyond. Reluctantly, Reece followed his friend inside. The interior of the museum was pitch black. Years of abandonment had left the windows either boarded up or so dirty that virtually no light penetrated. The air inside was stale and musty, carrying the smell of dust, mold, and decay. Reece switched on his flashlight, and its beam cut through the darkness, revealing the forgotten contents of what was supposed to have been a world-class tourist attraction. They were standing in what appeared to be the main exhibition hall, a large rectangular room with concrete floors and walls that had once been painted white but were now stained and peeling. Bradley took the camera from Reece and began filming, following behind as Reece led the way with the flashlight. The beam swept across the walls, illuminating various items that had been left behind when the museum was abandoned. There was a large framed print of a 19th century painting depicting the Battle of Rorkes Drift, British soldiers in their distinctive red coats, firing from behind, makeshift barricades of mealie bags and biscuit boxes, while Zulu warriors armed with shields and spears charged toward them in waves. Next to the painting was a poster for the 1964 film Zulu, showing Michael Caine and Stanley Baker in their British Army uniforms, dramatic and heroic. Further along the wall hung an isilangua, a traditional Zulu war shield, though Reece noted it appeared to be a replica rather than an authentic artifact. In the center of the room stood a long table, and on top of it was perhaps the most impressive item in the museum, a detailed diorama of the Battle of Rorkes Drift. The model was remarkably well-crafted, showing the mission station in miniature, with its defensive perimeter, the hospital building, the storehouse, and the surrounding terrain all accurately represented. Tiny painted figurines showed British soldiers manning the barricades while hundreds of Zulu warriors attacked from all sides. "Why did they leave all this behind?" Reece wondered, aloud, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Wouldn't they have taken it all with them?" "Don't ask me." Bradley replied from behind the camera. "This all looks rather Jesus." Both young men jumped, Bradley's startled curse cutting through the silence. The camera jerked wildly, momentarily losing focus before steadying again. Reece spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping toward the back of the room. "For God's sake, Brad, they're just mannequins," Reece said, his voice a mixture of relief and irritation. Against the back wall stood 3 life-sized mannequins dressed in authentic-looking British Army uniforms from the Victorian era. The redcoats were still bright, despite the years, and the white cross belts and buttons gleamed in the flashlight beam. Each mannequin held a replica Martini Henry rifle. But it was the faces that had startled Bradley. The mannequins' faces were pale and waxy, with painted features that seemed to stare blankly into the middle distance, in the darkness, illuminated only by the flashlight. They looked disturbingly real, like pale corpses standing at attention, forever guarding this abandoned place. "They're bloody creepy, that's what they are," Bradley muttered, his voice still unsteady. Reece played his light across the mannequins for a few more seconds, and both friends stood there in silence. There was something profoundly unsettling about this place, not just the mannequins, but the entire atmosphere. It felt wrong somehow, as if they were intruding on something that should have been left alone. "I've seen enough," Reece finally said. "Let's get out of here." Bradley didn't argue. Both of them made their way quickly back to the entrance, emerging into the bright sunlight with visible relief. The fresh air and warmth were welcome after the dark, stale interior of the museum. Despite the unsettling experience inside the museum, Reece hadn't forgotten his primary purpose for coming here. They walked down a dirt path, toward a tall white structure about 50 meters from the museum building. As they approached, it became clear this was the memorial, an obelisk made of white stone, standing perhaps 4 meters tall, with bronze plaques mounted on its sides. This was what Reece had traveled halfway across the world to see. His 4 times great-grandfather's name was somewhere on this memorial, along with the names of the other British and colonial soldiers who had died during the battle. Reece approached the memorial reverently, his eyes scanning the lists of names. Bradley filmed quietly, perhaps sensing that this moment was important to his friend, that it meant something deeper than just tourism. The names were listed in alphabetical order, along with their ranks and units. Reece's fingers traced down the columns as he read: Foster, C. James, C. Jones, T. "Ah, there he is!" Reece took the camera from Bradley and zoomed in on a specific name engraved in the bronze. Williams, J. Private, B. Company 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. For a moment, Reece was quiet, the camera still focused on his ancestor's name. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. 130 years ago, he stood right here, fighting for his life, and he survived. He went home, got married, had children, and eventually, down that line, I was born. That's something. Bradley remained quiet, allowing his friend this moment. Then Reece knelt down and carefully placed the wreath of red poppies at the base of the memorial. The bright red flowers stood out vividly against the white stone and brown earth. "All right, done," Reece said, standing up and brushing dust from his knees. "Let's go check out that hotel before we head back." They walked back to the Jeep, both of them feeling a sense of accomplishment. Despite the strange masks and the creepy interior of the museum, they'd achieved what they came for. Reece had paid his respects to his great-grandfather. Now they could visit the hotel site, take some photos, and then drive back to Durban in time for dinner. Neither of them had any idea that they would never make it back to Durban. That within 12 hours, they would both be fighting for their lives in the darkness of the South African wilderness. The drive from the museum to the abandoned hotel lodge took about 20 minutes, following a narrow dirt trail that wound around the base of Sinkindi Mountain. The landscape here was even more isolated than around the museum pure wilderness, with no sign of human habitation anywhere. Just grass, scattered trees, and the looming presence of the mountain rising behind them. The hotel came into view as they rounded a curve in the trail. 3 circular buildings, each topped with traditional thatched roofs, arranged in a triangular pattern around what would have been a central courtyard. The buildings were painted a faded orange color, now stained and weathered. Even in its incomplete state, you could see what the hotel was supposed to have been a luxury resort that blended modern amenities with traditional African architecture. But now, 12 years after construction had stopped, nature was reclaiming it. Cracks ran through the concrete pavement of the courtyard, with grass and weeds growing through them. The windows of all 3 buildings had been boarded up with sheets of plywood, many of which had warped or fallen off entirely. The thatched roofs, once carefully constructed, were falling apart, with huge gaps revealing the structural beams beneath. It looked like a place where people had worked, laughed, planned for the future, and then suddenly fled, never to return. Reece parked the Jeep near the largest of the 3 buildings, and both friends got out, cameras ready. This was exactly the kind of location Bradley loved exploring. Abandoned, atmospheric, and perfect for dramatic photos and video. They walked through the courtyard, their footsteps crunching on broken concrete and gravel. Bradley was filming everything, panning across the buildings, capturing the eerie beauty of this forgotten place. Reece walked ahead, peering through gaps in the boarded windows, trying to see inside. They were approaching the main building, the largest of the three structures, when Bradley suddenly stopped walking. "There," Bradley said, his voice low and tense. "In the shade of that building. There's something in there." Reece stopped and looked where Bradley was pointing. In the shadowy area created by the building's overhang, barely visible in the darkness, was a small figure. From the silhouette, it appeared to be a child, a young boy, no more than 10 years old, standing perfectly still and watching them. For several seconds, nobody moved. The boy stood in the shadows, Reece and Bradley stood in the open courtyard, and tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Then Reece cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Hello!" His voice echoed across the empty courtyard and faded into the surrounding wilderness. "Reece, don't talk to him," Bradley hissed urgently. But Reece's friendly greeting seemed to have the opposite of its intended effect. The boy, instead of responding or coming forward, suddenly bolted. He ran from the shadows, darting around the curve of the building and disappearing from view. "Wait, hold on a minute," Reece called after him, taking a few steps in that direction. "Reece, just leave him," Bradley said, a note of real worry in his voice now. Reece stopped, considering. The appearance of this child, alone at this abandoned site in the middle of nowhere, was strange. What was he doing here? Where were his parents? The nearest village had to be at least 5 kilometers away. But maybe there was a homestead nearby that they hadn't seen from the road. Still, something about the encounter felt off. The way the boy had been standing so still in the shadows, watching them, the way he'd run away, a moment they'd tried to communicate. It was unsettling. "Yeah, all right," Reece finally agreed. "Let's just get some photos of the outside and then head back. I don't fancy exploring inside now anyway." They began walking back toward the jeep, both of them quieter now, the excitement of exploration replaced by a vague unease. They were about 20 meters from the vehicle when Reece's footsteps suddenly quickened, and then he broke into a run. "Oh, God no." His voice carried a note of panic that made Bradley's blood run cold. Bradley ran after him, camera still in hand, and when he rounded the jeep to see what had caused Reece's alarm, he understood immediately. All 4 of the jeep's tires were completely flat, the vehicle sitting at an odd angle on the deflated rubber. For a moment, both friends just stared in disbelief. "Reece, what the hell?" Bradley's voice was high with stress. "I know, Brad, I know." Reece was already kneeling beside the front driver's side tire, examining it closely. "Who's done this?" Bradley demanded. Though the question was rhetorical, they both knew someone had done this deliberately. Upon closer inspection, the reason for the flat tires became horribly clear. Each tire had multiple stab wounds, small, deliberate punctures that had allowed all the air to escape. This wasn't accidental. Someone had vandalized their vehicle while they were exploring the hotel grounds. Frantically, both friends began searching the area around the jeep, looking for any clue as to who had done this. What they found made the situation even more bizarre and frightening. In the dust beside the jeep was a clear trail of small, bare footprints. The prints were from human feet, definitely not animal tracks, but they were small, the size of a child's foot. The trail led away from the jeep toward the brush beyond the cleared area of the hotel grounds. "They're child footprints, Brad," Reece said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "It was that little shit, wasn't it?" Bradley's fear was transforming into anger. "That kid we saw, he did this." But as they stared at the footprints and thought about the timeline, they realized something didn't make sense. When they'd seen the boy in the shadows, he'd been in the opposite direction from where the jeep was parked. For him to have slashed their tires, he would have had to run all the way around the building complex, slash 4 tires with multiple stab wounds each, and then somehow get back to where they'd seen him, all without making any noise that would have alerted Reece and Bradley. It was possible, but unlikely. Unless... "Brad," Reece said slowly, his mind working through the problem. "I think that boy might have been a decoy. He shows himself, we focus on him, and meanwhile someone else, another kid, maybe slashes our tires and disappears into the brush." The implication was disturbing. This hadn't been vandalism by a bored child. This had been planned, coordinated. Someone had deliberately stranded them here. But why? Reece pulled out his mobile phone, hoping to call for help, but he already knew what he'd find. No signal. They were too far from any cell tower. They were truly stranded. "What do we do?" Bradley asked, the anger draining from his voice, replaced by genuine fear. Reece looked around at the surrounding wilderness, then at the sky. The sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon. In a few hours it would be dark. "We need to walk back up the trail," Reece said. "Back toward those farms we passed on the way here. Someone there can help us, or at least let us use a phone to call for a tow truck." But Bradley was shaking his head. "Are you mad? It's going to take us a good half hour to walk back up there. Reece, look around. The sun's already starting to go down and I don't want to be out here when it's dark." "We don't have a choice, Brad," Reece shot back. "What else are we going to do? Sleep here?" "Yes, we sleep in the jeep. Tonight, and in the morning, we walk to those farms and get help." They argued for several minutes, their voices growing louder, stress and fear making them snappish with each other. But eventually, Reece conceded that Bradley might be right. Walking in the darkness through unfamiliar wilderness wasn't safe. They had food and water in their backpacks. They could lock themselves in the jeep, wait until morning, and then walk for help in daylight. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the best they had. As the sun sank lower in the sky, painting the grasslands in shades of orange and red, Reece Williams and Bradley Cawthorn climbed into their disabled jeep and locked the doors. Outside, the shadows lengthened. Night was coming to Rorke's drift, and something was waiting in that darkness. The footage from inside the jeep shows two young men trying desperately to stay calm in an increasingly tense situation. Hours had passed. The sun had set completely, plunging the surrounding wilderness into absolute darkness. Inside the jeep, Reece and Bradley sat in the front seats, their only light coming from the flashlight, which they kept pointed downward to conserve the batteries. The darkness outside the windows was total and impenetrable. No moon tonight, or if there was one, it was hidden behind thick clouds. No stars visible. Just pure, absolute blackness pressing against the glass from all sides. The silence was equally profound. No animal sounds, no wind, nothing. It was as if they'd been sealed inside a sensory deprivation chamber. To keep themselves distracted from their situation, from their fear, the two friends talked. The footage captures snippets of their conversation. They talked about home, about their families. Bradley talked about Emma, his fiancée, and how angry she was going to be when she found out about this disaster. He joked that she might call off the wedding. Reece talked about whether he should pursue his master's degree in history or get a proper job. They debated which team would win the upcoming rugby match, the Lions or the Springboks. 20 pounds says South Africa takes it, Bradley said. You're on, Reece replied. Wales is going to come through for the Lions. Mark my words. The mundane conversation was a lifeline, keeping them anchored, preventing them from thinking too much about where they were, about what might be lurking in the darkness beyond their fragile metal shelter. But even as they talked, both of them were acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. The jeep wasn't a fortress. Its canvas top and doors could be torn open by any determined person or animal. They had no weapons, no way to defend themselves beyond their bare hands. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. 10 o'clock became 11. 11 became midnight. Then suddenly the footage shows a change. Through the darkness, bright lights appear, vehicle headlights, approaching from the direction of the dirt trail. Reece? Bradley's voice is barely a whisper. Someone's coming. I see it, Reece replies, and there's tension in his voice, uncertainty. The headlights grow brighter, coming closer. They can hear the engine now, the crunch of tires on gravel. The vehicle is approaching slowly, carefully, as if the driver is looking for something or someone. The vehicle stops approximately 10 meters behind their disabled jeep. The headlights shine directly through the back window, flooding the interior with harsh white light that makes both young men shield their eyes. I think they might want to help us, Reece, Bradley says hopefully. But Reece isn't so sure. Oh, don't be an idiot. Do you have any idea what the crime rate is in this country? They're frozen in their seats, neither of them sure what to do. Then they hear a vehicle door open, then close with a solid thunk. Footsteps on gravel. Someone is walking toward their jeep. Then a voice calls out male, speaking English with a strong South African accent. The words are unclear on the footage, but it's clearly directed at them. The voice calls out again, more insistent this time. God, what the hell do they want? Bradley whispers. I think they want us to get out, Reece replies. The footsteps are getting closer. Through the window, silhouetted against the bright headlights, they can make out the shape of a person, a man, tall, broad-shouldered. And then quickly, Reece makes a decision. Turn off the camera. The footage cuts to black. When the camera turns back on, everything has changed. Reece and Bradley are no longer in their jeep, they're inside the stranger's vehicle, and it's moving. The footage is dark, the camera's low light capabilities struggling in the near total darkness. But you can hear everything. Bradley is holding the camera, keeping it low and hidden, probably tucked against his side or hidden in his jacket. This explains why the video is so shaky and poorly framed. He's trying to film without being noticed. From the sounds, this is a larger vehicle than their jeep, possibly a truck or SUV. The engine is louder, the suspension rougher. Reece is in the front passenger seat. His voice is clearer on the audio. Bradley is in the back. The old driver's voice was rough, his accent thick, his smile uneasy. He spoke kindly at first, but something about him felt wrong. When he suddenly stopped the truck and pulled a gun, the boys knew they were in danger. Moments later, they were left alone in the dark wilderness. The camera showed them walking, arguing, scared. Strange sounds followed, rustling, chirping, whining. Then glowing eyes appeared all around them. Dozens of shapes moved closer. The boys screamed, the animals attacked, and the camera cut out. Only the damaged footage and a torn rugby shirt were ever found. No bodies, no answers. Locals whispered that the people of Rorke's Drift still guard their land with ancient magic, that they can become wild dogs when outsiders trespass. Some say those masks near the museum were warnings. 16 years later, the place remains silent. Those who visit say they feel watched. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe, when night falls, something still hunts in the grass.